Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome back to Clearer Than Truth. I'm your host, Nathan Kiker, along with my co-host, George Bogdan. Today, we're joined by one of the world's leading historians of global international history and the Cold War, Yale professor Arne Westad. We're diving deep into his work on the Cold War and what it means for the current geopolitical moment. Arne, thanks for joining us.
It's wonderful to be with you guys.
You have been one of the leading authorities on the Cold War for some time. I want to ask, how does the U.S. versus China relationship and competition compare to U.S. versus Soviet Union for part one? And part two, is it simplistic to say we're in a new kind of Cold War with China? What do people get wrong by thinking that?
So I think the latter part is the more interesting one in many ways, certainly the easier one to answer. I don't see many similarities between the kind of international situation we have at the moment and what we were in during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Of course, there are some legacies going back to that time, right, which influences both the United States and China and other countries today. But overall, I have this sense, particularly in the United States, that people reach for the Cold War because it's the last great international system that they know something about, and some of us actually grew up during that period, so it's easier to turn to, rather than looking at the constituent parts of the kind of international system we have today, still in the process of being formed, but to me, very, very different from what the Cold War was like. So that said, I'm not in any way saying that we shouldn't look at the Cold War to draw lessons in terms of what we might be able to do today. I think there are plentiful lessons from the Cold War. I think there are plentiful lessons from history in general that we can try to draw on. But to me, it's not the Cold War that is the most immediate, I almost say unfortunately, because of the way it ended, generally peacefully, it's not the most immediate comparison to the kind of situation we are in now.
What is the most immediate comparison?
To me, it's the period before the First World War. It's the period from the 1890s and up to, when disaster struck in 1914. It's not exact. I mean, there are no exact historical parallels. Anyone who tries to tell you that is either a fool or an historian looking for a pay raise. I mean, it's not that. But there are striking similarities in terms of how the international system went from a very stable period and into an overall crisis, that we got in the last few years before the First World War, and the kind of situation that we have today. That a lot of things that we thought were going to last, if not forever, then for a very long time, all of a sudden came apart. And that created the kind of situation when a real world-class crisis came around, like in the summer of 1914, that we were not able to handle and wrecked most of the 20th century as a result thereof.
What could be our coming apart moment? And then I'll go to George next.
Oh, I think there are far too many that we can get through them even in...
Well, then which one keeps you up at night as a historian?
This is in a way the problem. I mean, this is also what brings us closer to the period before 1914. There were plenty of conflict points. No one could foresee exactly which one it was that would end in disaster. I mean, today you have the Taiwan Straits, you have the situation in Korea, you have Russian aggression in Ukraine, you have the wars in the Middle East. I mean, this is in a way the problem, that there are many of these that in and by themselves probably wouldn't get a global war going. But if something happened under the wrong kind of circumstances, they could contribute to a global conflagration, just like a conflict in the Balkans that most people hadn't even heard about in 1914 turned us in that direction.
Mm. Fascinating stuff. I certainly take your point about being careful about analogizing various periods. I when I was in graduate school, it was all about the Great Game. So it seemed, talking about Central Asia in this sort of cartoonish way. But in any case, I'm fascinated by some of your work on the Russia-China relationship. And I kind of returned to it actually when the Council on Foreign Relations was convening a study group on Russian-Chinese relations. And what I found fascinating about that kind of study group is that the dominant view was that China was the big problem, and China plus Russia was a little bit of a bigger problem, but basically it was a sideshow to talk about Russia-China relations. And that seemed to me to be rather, worrisome that was the view, in part because I think it minimized the tremendous strategic assets of Russia and its dominant position as the world's largest country in the world with this enormous nuclear arsenal. But I wonder, as a historian, when you look at the grand sweep of history, especially in the 20th century, do you think that Russia and China as a bloc are sort of overblown as a geopolitical unit, or?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think Acheson and others who are trying to think this through at the dawn of the Cold War got it more or less right. That the one thing that one should try to prevent were these two giants sort of coming together. Now, for various reasons, including ideological reasons that I have written about before, the United States, in some way, very contrary to its own interest, came to end up for a long time in a situation where it was in conflict with both China and Soviet Russia. Now, people could argue that that was bound to happen, that it couldn't be avoided. I'm not entirely sure that is the case, although it would have been difficult to prevent. But what it should tell us, I think, is that when we are in the kind of situation that we're in today, obviously, what the United States wants to do is to try to maximize its impact, particularly within the areas that are really significant today, which I think increasingly is Eastern Asia. And in order to do that, it needs to have a more stable situation overall, and particularly avoid a situation in which there are more and more countries that are not following the lead of the United States or the West, and finding this kind of now relatively new compact between China and Russia to be quite enticing, in part because of the sort of sovereignty issues that these two countries underline up against what many countries see as Western pressure.
Fascinating. I mean, I also would be interested in kind of comparing and contrasting, the kind of Soviet internal domestic economy to China's. I mean, because as someone who is sort of involved with some of the current trade policies, I was struck by this unwillingness, I think, of folks on the West to kind of understand the contradictions of China becoming this huge consumer product production hub, and at the same time, being sort of somewhat committed to these Marxist principles about how the state should run, whereas the Soviet Union never really became that hub of production. Instead, it was more of a rentier, oil-producing economy. Do you think this has real implications for them as kind of strategic competitors, or?
Exactly. I mean, I think that's a really, really good point, George. I think, China, even though it has been driven for the past generation by principles that most of us would find to be hyper-capitalist, if anything, has this political framework that is still remarkably similar to the Soviet Union, at its most evolved stage. I think more and more people in China themselves, by the way, are seeing this now. They're seeing much of Chinese politics, domestically more than internationally, as being out of whack with the kind of transformation that China has gone through socially and economically over the past generation. And where that's going to lead, no one knows. But it is really striking, and I see this every time I go to China, how many similarities that there are in terms of political structure between the Soviet Union and China. Again, they're not identical in any way. China today is a much more open, of course, much wealthier society than what the Soviet Union ever was, and it has a much stronger international position on a global scale than what the Soviet Union ever had. But I think remembering that origin, I actually taught a class about this at Yale in the spring, how the Chinese Communist Party was formed, how it took up Marxism, a particular kind of Marxism, how it learned from the Soviet experience, how significant this has been for the party through all of its now more than 100-year experience, is something that we should take more seriously. Not because of identical outcomes. I don't believe that is the case, nor in terms of believing that the two are similar in terms of decision making, but because there are so many structural similarities between the two.
Given the long history of tension between Russia and China, how durable is their current no limits partnership?
So that's one of the big questions, maybe one of the top 2 or 3 big questions in today's international affairs. I mean, if we look at history, and I'm actually now working on relations among great powers back in the 19th century, the relationship between Russia and China has waxed and waned. I mean, it's not common that some kind of closeness, never mind pseudo alliance as we have today between the two, last for very long. Usually, it ends in tears, as it has on several occasions in the past. There are some structural elements, though, in terms of today's international situation that tells me that at least it has the potential for lasting longer than what these compacts have in the past. And there are two reasons for that. I mean, the first one is the incredible weakness of Russia, of today's Russia, in terms of its overall international affairs, which go much beyond anything that was the case with the Soviet Union, its existence, and probably even Imperial Russia towards the end of its long life. So there is a dependence on China that we see very rarely in terms of two adjacent great powers. I mean, the only parallel that I find with this, and this brings us back to the parallel I drew up initially, is the increasing dependence of Austria on Germany prior to World War One. You could, of course, use the example of Britain and the United States as well during the Second World War, but that was during wartime. I mean, it was a different kind of setting. In peacetime, I think it's very rare that a great power has given up so much of its essential sovereignty to another state, as Russia now has with China. I tend to think that those kinds of ties make it more difficult to get out of it. But I also think they generate over time a lot of resentment. Just like there was a lot of resentment in China when it was the junior partner in this relationship. So, but in structural terms, yeah, I mean, that incredible dependence that Russia now has on China indicates to me that it might be more difficult, at least in structural terms, to dissolve this compact than what it has with Russia-China relations in the past.
I want to spend another minute on Russia. It's obviously weakened. What is Russia's general role in the world today, and what will it be in 2050? Will it be a dead power by then, or?
So Russia runs a real risk, particularly if it takes further military steps, almost anywhere, to face a very significant domestic crisis. I mean, the weakening of the Russian state, the weakening of Russian society, and not mind the economy, that the last decade or so now, since the first attack on Ukraine has led to, is extraordinary. And it's very hard to foresee exactly where it is going to end. I mean, it could end in case of further Putin military adventurism with the dissolution of the Soviet state. We don't know. I mean, it is extraordinary how weak Russia is at the moment. And we don't get that, I think, often, because we look at, how Russia, after all, has been able to fight, although with greater and greater difficulty in Ukraine. I mean, not really understanding how much smaller Ukraine is than Russia, but also because other countries, such as India or African countries or Southeast Asian countries, are still dealing with Russia, as some kind of partner. But they're doing that because they can take advantage of Russia's weaknesses. I mean, that's what we often don't get. And the ones who pay the price for all of this, in terms of political recognition of Putin, of course, the Russians themselves, who are at the receiving end of a policy that seems to me to be leading absolutely nowhere. So I think Russia is in very, very deep trouble. Could it, Russia has been in deep trouble on a number of occasions. Could it get out of that? Well, I think it would be in the interest of all of us that Russia somehow was able to find a way out of the free fall that it's in now. But, it's in no way guaranteed.
One more, and then George, of course. But Putin has had grand ambitions for Russia for 26 years. How did he let this happen? Where did he go wrong? And also, he's someone who reads history. How did he not understand the parallels that you've described and see them as red flags to proceed?
It puzzles me too. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Russia back in the 1990s. And I understand how the Putin phenomenon came about. I mean, there was chaos. This was the solution. There were people starving to death in the cities after the collapse of the Soviet Union. People wanted, a normal kind of existence, which is what Putin promised them. I mean, the normal, if you listen to Putin, normal is his favorite word, meaning in a way a return to the kind of stability that the Russians had seen during the Soviet era. And for the first decade, he was able, it very much helped by enormous incomes from the energy sector, to deliver that, at least deliver it compared to the 1990s. So I'm not surprised that he had a lot of support. What I am surprised about is how he was willing to throw all of that away in order to pursue some kind of global great power position that Russia simply doesn't have in it at the moment to move into. I mean, you can always argue with all political leaders, they should have known. But in this case, I think, given what Russia was like when Putin took over, from Yeltsin, an absolute disaster zone, I would have thought that he and the people working with him cherished the minimal progress that had been made in the early 2000s to such a degree that they wouldn't be able to gamble it away. I mean, some historians, of course, say that this is an integral part of what it means to be in charge of the Russian state. If Russia is not an empire, it's nothing. And there are elements of that in Putin's policy. But given what had happened during his first decade in power, there were so many indications that things were not moving in that direction, but rather that Russia's interests were in, a normal economic-based relationship with the rest of the world, that I'm still puzzled that this is the direction things took.
Me as well. Dr. Bogdan, you are a scholar on Ukraine and Russia. I want to bring you in, sir.
Well, I mean, I'd love to ask, just more broadly about what I call the psychology of NATO expansion. And there's so much about this topic that I think is troubling. I mean, I became a skeptic of it as I began to watch what the West was doing with its nuclear arsenals and what Russia was doing with its nuclear arsenals, or the USSR was doing with its nuclear arsenals. And I think, there may have been a hidden transcript of sort of strategic thinking in Russia that we don't acknowledge. But in the 1990s, there became this all-consuming debate about the Article 5 frontier of NATO, so where it ended. And, it's striking to me that as we look at contemporary NATO expansion, it's as though we are so attached to that narrative that the West, provoked or was right to expand NATO, that we're trying to essentially put a finger in Putin's eye by accepting new countries into the fold. And yet, when I look at the history of the Cold War, I get this intuition when I look at the Soviet Union's behavior, which is essentially to create what we call the cardboard castle, the Warsaw Pact, in response. This is not to take NATO seriously, but to almost mock it. And I mention this because, if you ask Russians about Sweden and Finland, they tell you that they have profoundly different strategic cultures. Sweden famously bashed Finland's president for not signing the Convention Against Landmines, and then he said back to them publicly, well, we're your landmine, Sweden, and you would fight to the last Finn. And so for a Russian to see these countries with different views entering this alliance, and they're supposedly going to protect each other. I'm mentioning all of this because I wonder whether it's addled our thinking about what Russia's strategic interests are, or how it would see an alliance like that. Because, in the West, we want to think that these multilateral institutions are so valuable. I know that was a lot, but I feel like there's a great deal to kind of unpack. So
I think that's a great discussion to have. And I think now is the moment really to start to think this through seriously, in part because we have enough historical evidence to go on to from the recent past to think about, how did this all come to be? I'm eager, I think, for people to start thinking more in the direction of what is happening in Russia internally. I mean, with the relatively high number of Russians who, at least initially, were willing to follow Putin, not just in the attack on Crimea and the Donbass in 2014, but also at least some way into the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And I think much of that has to do with the view that sees Russia's position, in spite of its tremendous weakness, as somehow unique, as somehow special, as somehow, outside normal European interactions. So, of course, they have a point. I mean, Russia is enormous. It's so big that it is very hard. It's hard for us as well to imagine Russia in some kind of meaningful reciprocal relationship with Europe or with the larger West. I think we made some mistakes back in the 1990s based on that. I don't think NATO expansion was among them. I think NATO expansion, in many ways, coming after the Cold War, given what the Cold War had been fought over, was almost necessary. I think the mistakes were more connected to how we dealt with Russia in the immediate post-Soviet era. But all of that is water under the bridge now. I mean, this is not the background. It's not the immediate reason why Putin is thinking the way he does or acting the way he does. But it does help him, I think, to some extent, with Russian public opinion, at least up to a point. I think now we are at that breaking stage where, if I'm not much mistaken, I think the next 6 months will be essential in terms of what the immediate outcome of this war for Russia is going to be.
Arne, people, not to cut you off, but people have said this for the last 4 years. Why the next 6 months? Everyone says the war is like so close to a breaking point.
No, I don't think the war is close to a breaking point. I think the war could go on for quite some time, and we don't know where the war is going to end. But with regard to Putin's position with regard to his own people, and how many Russians are thinking, we have pretty good evidence that has been changing for some time. And unless something happens that goes more in the Russian direction, which I think is highly unlikely with regard to the fighting in Ukraine, I think that position will erode further. I mean, this is usually what happens when wars have been going on for a very long time, and people do not see any way out, and their leaders do not have any real ideas about those suggestions for how this is going to be turned in a direction that will benefit the people of their own country. The States, of course, has a lot of experience with this itself, right? Then things start to shift. I mean, how far they will shift, I have no idea. But I think with regard to the perception that Putin and his leadership group has some kind of grand plan, some kind of way out of this that will benefit the Russians overall. If that is not in place and more visible to most Russians within the next 6 months or so, I think the regime could easily be in trouble.
As a historian, your perspective on this is valuable. How dangerous would that world be with a incredibly weakened and damaged Putin on his way out, potentially?
So I think what happens, I'm not necessarily even expecting that this would lead to Putin's demise. I think he would be politically weakened. I think he would feel more of a need to move further in the direction of a police state than what exists already. I think he probably will have to carry out, on top of all of this, some form of overall conscription, which I think politically would be disastrous because people don't like it, and we know that people don't like it in Russia. So I think the most likely outcome of that scenario is a weakened regime that would try to make use of its powers of repression at home at an even higher level than what we are seeing at the moment. But with repression comes increased resistance. And I think, at some point, and I have no idea when that would happen, people would start worrying so much about the direction that this takes for themselves and their families that they would act in opposition. I mean, that's just how things go with these kinds of things. It's the weakening of the regime that I think is most easy to see at the moment.
It's interesting then, George, but you, Mark Gelati, and David Ignatius, the only thing everyone's agreed on is Russia's done in its current iteration of being a global power to the extent it has been. But George, go ahead, sir.
No, I mean, I'm just fascinated to know. I mean, you've taught this series of subjects for so many years, and I wonder, one thing when I'm trying to interact with students and teach them about this conflict, I struggle to try to convey Russian nationalism or the character of Russian nationalism. And I mention this because it's so outside the frame of reference of my peers in my generation to imagine that something like the Second World War, where Russia lost the most civilians of any country, could be conceived as a kind of righteous fate in which the blood spilled in order to defeat fascism was actually correct, right? And not some kind of catastrophe. And so as things are actually going terribly for your country in a war, that might be confirming of a world view. And obviously this doesn't go on forever, right? And people become self-interested, or they realize how corrupt the state is. The state was pretty corrupt also in the Second World War. So, I'm trying to find ways to conjure in people's imagination what that mindset is like. And I wonder, what sort of texts or films, or is there something that really evokes that, or is it simply by reading deeply about Russian culture?
It's very hard to know exactly where to turn on this, George. I mean, I think reading, some of the great literature, for that matter, for both world wars from the Russian perspective, is something that does help with understanding that mindset. I mean, that idea that Russia is there simply to fight on because it is a state that is in a way given, that could never collapse, that will have to reassert itself at some point, and then bringing people to believe in that. The belief in the great leader, the belief that Russia has a global mission, all of that comes together. I was in China this spring in talking to some Chinese friends who are very critical of the United States and themselves, I'm sure, at least many of the members of the Chinese Communist Party. In reflecting on Russia, one of them said that, it's really hard for us, he said, to understand Russia. Because even though we want to be as close to the Russians as we possibly can, even if there is this kind of link between us, when you guys, meaning Americans and Westerns, when you speak, we understand each other. We might not agree, but we understand each other. The Russians speak a different kind of language, he says. I mean, a language that is very hard for us to understand. It is as if it were, his words, 19th century language. And there is a point in that, right? Russia is different on these kinds of things. But it isn't different enough, and that's part of the Soviet experience, right? That is extraordinary inflicting of damage on one's own population for one big idea, that's going to go on forever. I mean, Russia is different, but not that different.
The one thing that may not go on forever, but will probably for as long as the three of us are alive, is China's continued rise and dominance in at least half the world. How should our contemporary peers and historians understand current Chinese leadership? What do they want out of the world? What do they look to in history to guide them?
So this is what is so extraordinary, of course, is that right next door to Russia in the east, it's Russia that seems to have been most continuous decline since the Leonid Brezhnev era, is this country that has been able to pull itself up to create a future that no one believed in, a generation ago. When I first came to China as a student in the late 1970s, the country was dirt poor and terrorized. I mean, and things were not looking up, right? They rather looked to be getting worse. China had a GDP per capita that was below the African average and moving downwards, right? So, of course, what's happened in China over the past generation and a half now is an extraordinary transformation. And I just did a book with Chen Jian about the origins of that transformation, how China was able to move from that terrible desolation that it was in the 70s and up to something that wasn't a full development trajectory, but certainly looking upwards by the mid 1980s. And I think there were two things at work. I mean, one was that the Chinese leadership really understood, in a way the Soviet partners never understood, that one had to go to extraordinary measures, including the use of very deep market mechanisms in order to get their economy back in order and pointing up. So they didn't know how much it was going to grow, but they were willing to experiment with almost anything to get out of the disaster that they were in. And the second part, very relevant, I think, for our conversation today, is that China was in many ways lucky. This happened, the beginning of this phase happened right at the end of the Cold War and in the immediate post-Cold War era, where most countries, and especially the United States, were interested in pulling China into the global market economy. and wanted to see that as a strategic aim, right? So the combination of lucky with the geopolitics and willingness to question old truths at home created this growth machine, which I think is going to continue into the future. I mean, at a lower scale, of course, than what's happened in the past. The era of China's hypergrowth, more than 10% year-on-year GDP growth, is now in the past, in the deep past even. But even so, I mean, unless some kind of political disaster happens at home, I think that's possible but unlikely. Or, unfortunately, more likely that China gets itself involved in a war that it cannot win. I think overall the Chinese economy is going to continue to grow and be even more significant when you get up to the end of the next generation than what it is today.
Fascinating. Do you think China's looking at the conflict in Ukraine and using that as a reason to at least delay trying to take Taiwan? Do you think that is forever their calculus, or could they take away something different from the Ukraine crisis for their own international politics?
So I don't think we should believe that China watching what's happened in Ukraine, that it would influence China's own calculus in a concrete sense with regard to Taiwan. But let me just talk about the Ukraine parallel. I mean, what has surprised many Chinese, which says something about, possibly even something you could call a level of naivete in terms of China's foreign policy making, was how easily Russia got into trouble. There was this idea that, at least in military terms, Russia was doing quite well. Not only was it a nuclear power, but it had been able to go back to some of its Soviet-era technology and improve on it in ways that the Chinese found admirable in all ways. And then, what happens from 2022 happens, and the Chinese are wondering, how do they get it that wrong? Again, someone I met during a recent trip to China said that, it's really hard to explain to the comrades how Russia could end up in the kind of situation that it is in today. So, of course, the Chinese leadership are learning from what is happening in Ukraine, but I don't think that will deflect them from the overall aim of reconquering, as they see it, Taiwan. I think still they would prefer to do that by some form of what they would see as peaceful means. But I think they are definitely ready for acting militarily if they think that is the last resort that they would have to turn to in order to avoid Taiwan moving further away from Chinese sovereignty.
I have one closing question, but I want to give George a chance to jump in if he has anything else. But
Go ahead.
Arne, as I mentioned at the top, you're one of the preeminent scholars on the Cold War and just sort of as a theorist. How will historians describe the world order that we are in and that we'll be in over the next 25 years?
First and foremost, as a multipolar order, in which the United States and China are the most important and most powerful poles, but where they are not able to determine the outcome of international affairs in the way that, say, the United States and the Soviet Union were able to determine them during most of the Cold War. I think it is going to become increasingly multipolar. I think countries like India, Brazil, Turkey, and among those who already have a high level of development, first and foremost Japan, I don't think they are going to try to conform to some kind of US-China duopoly. I mean, we can see that at the moment, that it's simply not happening. Neither will Russia, although Russia is tied into this fateful relationship with China. So I think, in overall terms, if we want to characterize what's going to happen, and I believe really for the next generation, as you indicated, it is multipolarity. It is an increased level of nationalism in terms of international economic affairs, first and foremost, but also probably more in political affairs. And it will be, unfortunately, a number of smaller wars, if we are lucky. They will remain small. That will challenge all of the great powers to keep great power peace. I think that's the framework that we are looking at the moment.
So not necessarily a safer world over the next 25 years.
No, I think it's what you're seeing at the moment is a very unsafe world indeed. I mean, I think we are now in a situation where if a world-class crisis, a kind of black swan event that we cannot see at the moment, like what happened in the summer of 1914, were to come along, I'm not sure how well we will be able to handle it. I mean, particularly with all of the conflicts going on in the world at the moment. By themselves, these conflicts would be manageable. But if something else happens, they could so easily contribute to this broader conflagration that I'm so worried about.
This is fascinating. Arne, you have written a number of fantastic books, specifically for me, the Cold War and the Coming Storm. Where can our listeners continue to follow your scholarship and read your books? And what are you working on next?
I think the most important thing right now for me is to get people to read my most recent book, The Coming Storm, which is about many of these things that we have talked about.
Yeah.
It's a brief book. It's probably the briefest book that I ever written. I also tend to think that it's quite readable. Just don't read it at night without something to console you with.
I did, and it was rough.
I can imagine. I always recommend some kind of consolation at the end of it, because it is a dark picture. But then I also think that we are in really, really challenging times. So I've reacted to that the way that historians often do, by going back in time and trying to understand how much of the overall structures that we've seen, over the past 200 years came into being. So right now I'm working on a book about relations among great powers in the mid-19th century.
Wonderful. And these books can be found wherever books are sold, but are you on social media or Twitter?
Wherever books are sold. I'm an infrequent guest to social media. I think that might be part of the reason why I was actually able to finish a book this year.
Really
Wonderful.
agree.
Arne, thank you so much for the time, for your scholarship, and we look forward to having you on in the future. Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to tune in next time and share with your friends.